What in the world is gender? If you've been following the program for some time, you know we've done a number of shows on the topic of gender theory from a perspective of endocrinology, of science, of philosophy, medicine, psychiatry. But I think in order to really have a rational dialogue on the entire subject of gender, we have to define the word. Like, what is gender? I mean, if you're like me, it's been a pretty confusing road trying to figure that out, because you look at a government document, it says gender, male or female. Okay, sounds like biological sex. And people say, well, gender is just a social construct. Okay, so is biological sex a social construct? Well, no, we're talking about the patriarchy and how it's imposed rigid norms of masculinity and femininity. Oh, okay, so if somebody's transgender, are they changing their social construct? Well, no. Well, then we're talking about gender identity. Well, what do you mean by that? As you can see, it just seems like it's shifting. Nothing seems more gender fluid than the word gender itself nowadays. And so I thought it'd be good to have a show just to understand what is the authentic Catholic understanding of the word gender. Now, before we dive into this, first, Lent is upon us, and so I want to encourage you guys that are watching the program or listening to it on the podcast to take a try with Exodus Lent. Now, some guys are like, I want to do that Exodus 90 thing. Isn't that like months of cold showers? Well, the cool thing with the Exodus Lent is you don't have to worry about the cold showers. You can take showers as hot as you want, but there still is a time of asceticism, meaning no snacks and sweets and social media. All that gets cut out. But in place of that, you've got weekly fellowship with brothers, times of prayer, biblical reflection, and study. And so by the end of the 90 days, come Easter Sunday, you're going to kind of walk away with just a refreshed understanding of what it means to live a full Christian life, chocolate, bunnies, and all. And so if you want to check out Exodus 90 and the program they have for Lent, just go to exoduslent.com/Jason Evert, and you'll find the details there. Also, just want to do a big thank you for everybody who's supporting us on Patreon. Because of your generosity, we've just been able to hire a video editor over in the Philippines, a new guy that we've come in touch with, and he's going to be taking all these episodes off my plate and slice and dice them, create micro content, start throwing that back up on YouTube. I've just not had the time to turn all these shows into YouTube individual content videos. And thanks to the patrons, this is now possible. And he's going to take that off my plate so that we're able to get more content than ever on YouTube. So thank you, patrons. And if anyone wants to join the Patreon community, please just go to patreon.com/Jason Evert. And that's a page where you can support what we're doing, support our family, and help us to spread this message. Now, today's guest, a very well qualified person to speak on this subject, Dr. Jennifer Morales. She's a director of research for the International Institute of Culture and Gender Studies. Now, a lot of times people hear that phrase gender studies and it's like, okay, red flag. No, there's a very authentic way to understand that. She is a graduate of my alma mater, Franciscan University of Steubenville, and then she went on to graduate studies in theology at Pontifical Universities of the Angelicum and the Gregorium, as well as the John Paul Institute for Studies on Marriage and the Family. From there, she went on to get a doctorate from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross and became a professor at the of moral theology at Notre Dame Seminary. And she's also taught courses on gender and Catholic feminism all over the world. And so, Dr. Jennifer, I want to welcome you to the program. I hope you guys enjoy this interview.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you and to have some way to connect back with people in the U.S.
Now, yeah, you're joining us from France. What brought you over there to France?
Research, actually. So research on gender, on masculinity and femininity. And then it's interesting, it was specifically in different cultures. So now I ended up staying because of love. So I'm a Cajun woman married to a French man. So I'm constantly doing research on French masculinity.
Oh, wow. And I heard, did you get trapped there during COVID or something?
Exactly. I was supposed to be in Paris for 2 weeks doing a couple of interviews, and I arrived on the 14th, and the 17th, President Macron shut us down. So 3 months gives you a lot of time to work on your French.
Oh, wow. And then is that when you met your husband, when you were locked into the country?
And kind of, we had been friends for about 12, 14 years. We met in Rome, and it had remained a friendship. And I came to visit him after the 3 months. And when we met again, it was clear why I'd been praying for him for the last 10 years.
Nice. And God's like, I've got an idea. Why don't I shut down the airport and let you guys think this over a little longer? So Good divine matchmaker at work there now. Tell us about the ministry that God's given to you. I usually, when I think of ministry, don't think of it in terms of what we're doing for God. It's more his gift to us. And so tell the listeners a little bit about the ministry and, why you felt that God was calling you to do that.
Thank you. So our ministry specifically, and together I'm working with the International Institute of Culture and Gender Studies, is that of responding to the call of St. John Paul II to create a theology of masculinity and femininity. So in his Theology of the Body catechesis, there's this beautiful line where he says, a theology of the body rooted in the reality that we're created in the image and likeness of God gives birth or leads to a theology of masculinity and femininity. And for 6 years, I taught in a seminary, and I remember every time that phrase came up, the seminarians would raise their hands and they would be like, what does that mean? Yeah. Like, that's a really good question. And I'm like, and this is a JP2 mic drop. Like, he says something amazing, drops the mic and walks away. And I said, because he's leaving it to us. Yeah. Right. And after about 6 years, my time there working with seminarians, with lay people who had all of these questions, with priests, it was just clear that this is what God was calling myself and a group of other alumni from the seminary to. So, which is why we formed the Institute. Yeah. And we use philosophy, theology, art, science, really to talk about what that means to be created male and female in the image and likeness of God. And I do that specifically through scriptural exegesis and also by touring. This sounds like just a way to roll the bank budget, but by touring the world and speaking with experts in different cultures. Gaudium and Spes says that there are treasures hidden in every culture that tell us about the truth about the human person, and that these two belong to the church and they have to be sought out. And so that's part of my job, is to go to the different cultures, the different countries, and to see how those realities of human experience, right, like JP2's Theology of the Body, looking at scripture through human experience, help us to better understand the revelation found in God's word.
That's awesome. Because we talk about the Catholic understanding of gender. The word Catholic means universal. And so how can we properly understand gender if we're just looking at it through the lens of American culture? It's just kind of a myopic viewpoint. And I think, for, kids going to university in America, if you go to like some, American progressive university's gender studies department, you'll hear all kinds of stuff of just like, oh, well, if you look around the world, you look at these Pacific Islanders and their concept of gender is this, and see, that promotes transgenderism. And now we're going to look at these Romanian girls and that busts gender stereotypes. Now let's go to the Dominican Republic and here and there and look, see, gender is a spectrum. See, it's proved by all these different cultures. And I think a lot of the university kids, they don't know anything going on. Oh, Native Americans believed in two-spirit people, so, they believed in transgenderism too? Oh, I guess it must have been the white European colonials that must have imposed this patriarchal idea of a masculine femininity in the culture, and we got to get back to our ancient, global roots of, gender being some spectrum. And so I think a lot of universities do just buy it. It just sounds, oh, well, that sounds pretty authoritative. But from your studies, maybe dive into that. Like, what is the Catholic understanding of gender, and what have you seen around the world? So specifically, we'll start with the Catholic question. Yes. What is the Catholic understanding of this word? Because it's just got so many different potential definitions. I think it kind of just can confuse the heck out of anybody trying to make sense of it all.
Yeah, no, it's a huge question. It's so important. And it's so necessary to dive into it. So one of the first things that we have to say is the Catholic understanding of gender is absolutely radical. And we don't think of Catholics as being radical. We don't think of our faith as being radical, right? We say, this is what we've been doing for 2,000 years. We kind of think of ourselves as like this staid, matronly woman who sits like on, and we have to remember that that Christ is, as Dorothy L. Sayers would say, this Anglican theologian at the beginning of the 20th century, he's like this homeless wanderer, like this vagabond who wears a crown of thorns and who calls us to follow him. And this is exactly what the church does in terms of gender. So a little bit of we'll do like a historical, philosophical brief journey, if you'll let me. About 400 years before Christ, clearly these were already questions. What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? What are the relationships? Is that cultural, or is it social? Is it biological? And in fact, Aristotle and Plato had really already tried to answer these questions. So Plato, for those of y'all who have read the Republic, you might remember this, who is very much in terms of feasting, right? The Republic takes place in this huge feast for the gods. All these young men have been eating and drinking all day long, and they're like, tell us about the perfect society. And while he's telling them about the perfect society, he says that in this relationship between men and women, what we're looking at is really an equality, because men and women are basically the same. Right? So for Plato and for Socrates, what's important is the world of the forms. We don't need to get into that. But what that means is the only thing that's important about the human person is the soul, right? And he says men and women have the same capacities in their soul, just like greyhounds have their same capacities for being good watchdogs. And he says, and so what we see is men and women are the same, and they're equal. They're equal because they're the same. Right? And he said, for this reason, we can give men and women the same tasks, and we have to form them for the task that society desires them to have. Right? So it's interesting because we're already beginning to see there almost like a contemporary idea of gender, right? Like you are formed by society. Like what matters is this interior, like the outside is just an appearance that we see. Yeah. So Aristotle responds to him, and it's really funny if you go ahead and you read Aristotle's response, because he sounds like he's angry, right? You're reading this guy who wrote 2,400 years ago. You could hear like the anger coming off the page. He's like we've ever heard anything more ridiculous in our lives. Like, how can you make a comparison between people and greyhounds? Because greyhounds don't even keep house. And people have to keep houses. And he says, clearly when we observe, because Aristotle was really big on empirical observation, right? So all of you who love the scientific method would love Aristotle. He says, clearly if we observe, we see that women are different from men, and their difference makes them inferior. He says men are capable of generating outside of themselves. Women can only kind of warm things up. Yeah. And the fact, this inferiority that they have, he says, even we see, because body and soul are interconnected for him, right? We see even in a woman's diminished rational capacities. She can't even rule her own passions, right? So you can tell Aristotle encountered a couple of angry women in his time. One or two. She can't even rule her own passion. So obviously she has to be ruled by a man and kept safe in the house, right? So what you kind of see there is perhaps like a contemporary, we can hence like kind of this contemporary idea of sex, that sex is biological material. And if we don't watch out, it's going to determine who we are in our place in society. Mm-hmm. So what we end up having from the Greeks, and we have to keep in mind, Athens, where both of these theories comes out of, was the most repressive Greek city-state for women. So we didn't even kind of get a fair chance at the beginning. Yeah. But what we end up is having two alternatives, right? We have what's often called like a sex unity, which is men and women are equal because they're the same, and then a sex polarity. Men and women are different, and because they're different, one is superior to the other, and typically men are superior to women. And when Christ comes onto the stage, what we see is something that explodes all of those ideas and explodes all of these notions. And we see this specifically if we go and look at Matthew 22, 23 through 31. So all of you, this is brief scriptural quiz. Where is that? What am I talking? I'm not going to make you answer, Jason. Yeah. But this is the question of the Sadducees asking about the woman who has 7 wives, right? So when she is resurrected, who will be her the 7 wives? Sorry. 7 husbands. Yeah. It would be a much more interesting story, perhaps, if she had 7 wives. Yeah. Okay, so it's a woman who has 7 husbands, right? And so she marries the first husband. They don't have children. The law requires that after he dies, in order to continue his name, that she marries his second brother. They have no children. Law requires after he dies. So she marries all 7 brothers, and they say in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? Right. And it's meant to show the ridiculousness of believing in a resurrection of the body, because the Sadducees don't.
Yeah.
And while you might be able, right, polygamy isn't completely out of the question, to have a woman married to several men at the same time is certainly out of the question. And the response of Jesus helps us to understand why the Catholic teaching on gender is radical. Because he responds, he says, you know neither the scriptures nor the power of the God. For when they are resurrected, they will be as the angels, or they will be as the sons of God. And he says they will neither be married nor given in marriage. Now, when we hear this, we think perhaps Jesus is being a bit repetitive. This is part of the problem of hearing it in English. In some other languages, it's slightly clearer. But if we want to be interesting, we would go back to the Greek, and we would actually read St. Jerome's complaint as he is translating into the Latin. He says, now in the Greek, it's quite clear that to be married is to be a man. To be given in marriage is to be a woman. And he says, because you would only say these of things that can be married and decide not to be, right? He said, we wouldn't say this about stones or about plants. And he says, clearly we're speaking about men and women, that they will be resurrected as men and women. And he says, but the text doesn't make that clear in the Latin. And it doesn't either in the English. Mm-hmm. But when we think about that, that's when we realize the time bomb that Christ has dropped in our lap. Because now he's telling us that men and women are not only different, as we would have heard already from Aristotle, but that they're also equal, as we would have heard from Plato. But that this difference and this equality is so good that it will perdure for all of eternity. We're not just created male and female. We will also be resurrected as men and as women. And this means that there is something profound about what it means to be a man and a woman. And that this something that is so profound and so good will be part of who we are for all of eternity. Equal, different, and yet in some way both mirroring the perfection of God. This is the Catholic teaching on gender.
Yeah, so it's not simply a biological reality of like, well, you can tell this is a man, that's a woman because the chromosomal makeup or the gonads or the secondary sex characteristics, the DNA, that's how you prove it. It goes deep as the soul, in a sense. And in fact, yeah. the identity of a person's gender goes much deeper than the physical. This is an indication of a physical manifestation of the reality of the person made visible through the human body. And
exactly.
That's why, within the Catholic tradition, we continue to honor saints in heaven by their gender. St. Peter, pray for us, that Peter is a man in heaven, even though his body is still on earth.
Yes, this is true. And one of the amazing things, too, is the way that we see this not just in Christ's words in Scripture, but also in his actions, that he's a radical way. You have to think about this of interacting with both women and men. So you can think about the parables, for example. He uses parables that speak about both men and women, often pairing them together. So we see the shepherd who looks for the lost sheep. We also see the woman who looks for the lost coin, right? A lot of his healings, he doesn't just heal men, he heals men and he heals women at the same time. In his ministry, he's accompanied by both. We see clearly a difference also in the fact that only apostles are men, but in his ministry, he accompanies both. He's accompanied by both. He preaches salvation to both. And he also permits and almost encourages quiet social rebellion. Mm-hmm. So you can think about the stories of Mary and Martha. These two sisters are incredible, especially those women who have sisters will know. I'm sure there's something analogous to men having brother. Do you have brothers, Jason?
One brother.
Okay. So maybe sometimes y'all see yourselves also like in the Mary and Martha story, but it'd be like Tom and Sam or something, or Jason and Sam.
Yeah.
So what's really interesting about the first story, which is the one that most of us remember, this is Mary and Martha at the home. Jesus comes to visit them, and Martha's busy with the serving, and Mary is sitting at Jesus's feet and listening to him. And Martha reprimands her sister, but she does so through Jesus. And she says, "Tell my sister to help me." And Jesus says, Mary has chosen the better part, right? Let her be. And when we hear that, we're like, oh, that's so beautiful. It's talking about contemplation. We all need to be better Marys, especially those of us who in some way are involved with the church. Like all of us feel that we're constantly being Marthas. But what's extremely revolutionary here is the fact that Martha is being obedient to her sociocultural role as a woman, right? So women were supposed to be busy with the serving so that men could be learning, sitting at the feet of the rabbi, of the master, and learning from him. And this is actually what Mary's doing, what the men are supposed to be doing. Martha's doing what the women are supposed to be doing. And so Martha's kind of like, tell her to get into some gender conformity.
Yeah.
And Jesus is like, no, like you cannot impose on her way to be a woman, because this is what she's called to. Yeah. And in fact, every time we see Mary in the Gospels, we'll see her 3 times with her sister. She's always in that masculine position, what was considered a masculine position, throwing herself, falling herself at the feet of Jesus. And so it's just beautiful to see even there, right? Christ acknowledges this created difference between men and women. He proclaims that there's a resurrected difference. And at the same time, he doesn't force them to conform to social roles. He helps us to realize that each man and woman has a particular vocation, and their way of living it out is going to stretch the way that we think about gender in that particular culture.
Now, when you were speaking earlier about Aristotle, and his idea that, if we're different, then one has to be better than the other. So we guys will take that top role, and then you ladies can be, the more submissive, will be the more dominant gender. And you can see that how it would feed into, the second wave feminism of just almost this Marxist idea behind feminism of this is a class struggle, and in order to eliminate this class struggle, we need to eliminate sexual differences. There needs to be sameness. Sameness is the answer to sexual difference, because if we have this, not just equality in the sense of voting rights and things like that, but just uniformity of sameness, that's the only way out to escape these oppressive patriarchal gender norms. And you can see how it would flow right into that and feed into it. So, maybe speak for a moment of just like, why does contemporary gender theory exist? What led into this, and why has this been created, this mass chaos and confusion on gender? Why does contemporary gender theory exist?
Yeah. So this is a wonderful question. So I think this is one of my favorites, actually, Jason. So we have, the question is, if we have this radical teaching that happened 2,000 years ago, then why, like you said, are we dealing with things that deal with equality, sameness, difference, class struggles, sexual inequality, these injustices that exist? And this is the case because although we clearly see this revolution of Christ in the early church, right? You can think about Priscilla and Aquila, who were a married couple, both teaching the faith. Priscilla, 4 out of the 6 times that they're mentioned as a couple in sacred scripture, it's her name that's given first, which is not typical. So St. Paul is clearly giving her precedence. If we look at the Middle Ages, women had voting rights. Women were voting in France. So if you look it up on Wikipedia, it tells you it's 1945. It's not the case. Like, read French historians will tell you this is not true. So women were very much politically involved. They were also very economically involved. So St. Louis wanted to make sure that everybody was, his bureaucrats were in line. And so he sent spies to different areas in France to look at his bureaucrats and make sure that they were there. And at the same time, throughout Europe, right, we see in those spy notes and also in condemnations for usury that women were really active economically. So women were doctors, women were millers, women were merchants, women were hairdressers. They were doing all these things that we think of as only having been possible, right? Like in the 1980s or something, after kind of second wave feminism. So women were very much a part of the social life until about, and historians will disagree here, but they'll say in Western Europe, it would be between the 15th century and the 17th century. Why? Specifically because of what you said. There's this recuperation of ancient Greek thought that begins to permeate everything. And it's not just, we tend to think, well, philosophy is philosophy. It kind of sits in its own little corner and does its own thing, and the rest of life goes on, right? Hopefully, we as Catholics have come to understand philosophy permeates everything. So even if you hear Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he says, women exist for purposes of physical pleasure, intellectual pleasure, and childbearing, right? And he's basically almost quoting the Greeks here. So women once more often become confined to the home if they're what we would call middle class. Working women, of course, still exist because when you're poor, you work. It doesn't matter whether or not there's feminism, you're still working. Yeah. But a lot of the legislative rights that existed for women no longer exist. Inheritance and property rights are no longer there. If you look at, for example, at first wave feminism in the United States, you see that men had the right to beat their wives, to beat their children. Elizabeth Cady Stanton says a man can apprentice his child, his son to a rum maker and his daughter to a brothel, and a wife can say nothing. And she says, if these are the laws that we live under when only men can vote, then women clearly need the right to vote, right? So we see these clear injustices because this kind of idea of sex polarity, Aristotle, Greek thought has kind of been recuperated. And at the same time, there's a lot of philosophical work going on in France. Two authors in particular. So one of them with whom y'all might be more familiar, her name is Simone De Beauvoir, and she wrote a book called The Second Sex, right? There's a lot of history in it that's completely inaccurate. And I don't know if it's because she didn't have time to do her historical research or what. You know, as an author, you always have to like be kind to other authors because you know you have your own faults. But she has this line that's completely not just mind-blowing, it is world-changing. In which she says, one is not born a woman, one becomes so. And historians will tell you, philosophers will tell you, theologians will tell you, no matter where they stand on the sex-gender question, this is the first time there's a distinction between sex and gender. Right? The first time there's a distinction between the fact that you are female at birth, right? But that there are all of these cultural values that are assigned to being female that you can either accept or that you can reject, right? So it's very interesting. The book is extremely long. For those of you who are thinking of reading it in this moment, oh, this is not a take it to the beach and read a book. This is the unabridged version in English. So don't do that. But you see her fighting very much against sex polarity, right? She says all of the things that activity, initiative, all these things get assigned to men, and passivity, sitting at home, acting basically like a doll, she says. These are the things that are assigned to women, and these are the things that we are constantly being pressured by society to conform to, right? So you see she sees the sex polarity in society. I'd say she kind of struggles with that herself, right? She doesn't see, for example, the beauty of receptivity and how that's different from passivity, how men would also need to learn that. But she clearly makes this sex-gender distinction. A couple of decades later in France, we also have another philosopher writing. His name is Michel Foucault. And he writes a book that's extremely influential. It's called The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, right? So again, this one is a short book, but I only recommend it if you want to spend lots of time with your dictionary. The people who translated it from French into English certainly spent a lot of time with theirs. And what he says here is very interesting. It was taken up by a First Things article in 2015 by Michael Hannon, I believe, which is called Against Heterosexuality. But in this book, he talks about the fact that up till, he would say, the 18th or the 19th century, we would talk about sexual acts, but we wouldn't talk about persons in definition of their sexual acts, right? So he gives the example of a confessor's manual, right? So all of you think that your priest is extremely intelligent, and he is. But until very recently, and you can still find them, there have always been confessor manuals that help priests to kind of look at what are the sins that people commit, right? What are typical questions to ask them about these sins? And then what are penances that can help them to grow in virtue at the same time? And he says, when we look at these, we see that there is clearly questions about acts that deal with a sexual nature. He says, but it's only when we begin to look at, for example, the demographic questions, which come in the 18th to 19th century. So you can think about Malthus, you can think about eugenics movements. He says it's not until psychology and medicine begin to look at the sexual acts in detail. He says that they take people who would have committed, he said, for example, homosexual acts, what we would have called homosexual acts or sodomitic acts before, acts of sodomites. And he says, and by looking at the entire person in extreme detail, beginning with their childhood, he says they basically take that act and make it their entire identity. No longer do we talk about the sexual acts of a person. We talk about a person beginning with their sexuality as if that is their identity. He even says we kind of take their soul and change the soul of a person who might commit homosexual acts and look at that soul as if it's no longer male or female, right? So what we see in both of these authors is extremely, extremely important, is this idea that my acts now become my identity. Or Foucault goes even further, my desires become my identity, right? And even more so, I'm constantly struggling against a society that is trying to assign value to my acts and thus value to my identity. So if you want to combine that with the sex polarity and with the injustices, what you see is a desire to escape from one's sex, right? A desire to do gendered things that are different so that you can no longer impose on me that I am an inferior person. Right? And this is really how gender theory comes into being. On the one hand, it's a pushback against injustices, right? And on the other hand, it's this idea that my acts are no longer acts that I perform, right? That might make me more virtuous or more vicious, but that my acts, specifically my sexual acts, go ahead and give me my identity. So this means, for example, and Michael Hannon points this out in his Against Heterosexuality article, that now if I'm a woman and I find that that other woman is possibly attractive, right? Which hopefully you think other women besides yourself are beautiful. Or a man, right? A young man who says, well, this is a good looking guy. Hopefully you have the capacity to admit that other men are also good looking, right? You begin to worry, perhaps this desire has now defined my entire being. No, was that helpful, or was that?
No, I was just reading a book yesterday. I was talking about Simone De Bevoir, quoting that one passage where she said that one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman, and the author said that when a feminist quotes that at the beginning of a speech, it's equivalent to genuflecting before you enter a pew. Meaning it's so enshrined within feminism that, this is what we become. It's not something that's imposed upon you. That's something, you evolve into. And it is interesting is just that to hear the history and the philosophy behind our attractions becoming our identities. I remember reading Cardinal Raymond Burke, who said that the twofold expression of the human person is male and female, not heterosexuality and homosexuality. Because once we begin to define our identity by who we're attracted to, then our behavior will always flow from our identity. And if my identity is created in the image and likeness of God as his beloved son or daughter, behavior flows from that. But if my identity is who I'm sexually attracted to, then my very personhood is being stifled if I can't express that in the genital way. And so to me, it's not simply just something of like the LGBT thing, but the T thing. that what is my identity? You know, in this culture where there's so much disconnection from family and belonging, that we're looking like, who the heck am I? And then all of a sudden this adolescent who's going through the throes of self-discovery and confusion all of a sudden finds acceptance online or in, you know, the Gay Straight Alliance on campus. And I found this welcoming community, and I'm finding my identity in this. But, you know, with the trans thing, what I seem to be noticing is that once you kind of untether a person's identity from their biology, then it's got to attach somewhere. Your identity has to anchor onto something. And what it ends up anchoring onto, if it's not the attractions, it would be like the personality. But here's the problem. There's as many personalities as there are persons. And so if our identity is hinging on our personality and our gender needs something to attach to, well, if there's an infinite number of personalities, there are going to be an infinite number of genders as well. And that's where we're kind of headed. You know, it's not simply to have one or two, but like an endless spectrum of them, which will end up meaning gender becomes simply meaningless. Because if it's not attached to our biology, then how is it defined by? You know, all of a sudden it just becomes so vague, it simply becomes meaningless, which is, I think, what their answer was in the first place for the sexual difference. We've got to eliminate it, and then we're going to get rid of oppression. So just wipe the whole thing out, and then we're free. Does that seem like a fair assessment to you?
Exactly. So there's a very real, and this is extremely important to say, there's a very real assessment that there is injustice in the world, right? And this exists, and it's important for us to say, especially because I think Catholics have this amazing record of pushing back against injustices as well as pushing back against social stereotypes. I'll give just a brief example here. I always think of Saint Joan of Arc, right? So a lot of times people try to subvert her for their movement, for this movement or that movement. I read this really long book about this woman who's extremely anti-church, which meant she did a lot of really good historical research. And if she said something, I didn't think she was being, you know, POD, pious and overly devotional. But she pointed out, you know, like, we know Saint Joan of Arc wore men's clothes. And at the same time, for her being a woman was extremely essential to her identity, because there was a prophecy that the war would be finished by a virgin, would be finished by a maiden. And when she led her army, she led an army in which there was no gambling allowed, there was no cursing allowed, there were no prostitutes allowed, and she had mass and confession for those men every single day, right? So she did something that was considered masculine, but she did it in such a way that it was feminine. Right? She continued to exercise what we would call her feminine genius, that care for the other person, that openness to the other person, in the way that she led her army even to victory. Right? So there's this clear assessment of injustice regarding men and women and men, and at the same time, we would say that the diagnosis is correct, but the prescription is wrong. Right? We're not going to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We're not going to throw out women because there has been oppression. What we need to do, and for all of those who quote Simone De Bevoir, as she says in the last 3 pages of her book, is she says, once we have rediscovered, or once we have discovered equality between men and women, we will discover the true mystery of their differences and of the love that unites them. Right? And this is what gender ideology has missed. Yeah. That there's a beauty in those differences. There's a mystery in those differences. And it's only when we acknowledge the equality and the difference that we can begin to discover them.
No, it's beautiful. What I've heard of critiques of her writing is that, you know, on one page, she'll seem to be going in this direction. Then on the same page, say something that's the polar opposite of it. And then back in this other way, and it just seems, you know, just obscure at times. They're like, wait a minute. Yeah, I'm on board. Wait a minute. Wait, doesn't this contradict that other page? It almost feels like there's this, you know, this understanding of reality that she gets that, you know, when you try to read through it with a critical lens, it just seems like she's hopping from one place to the other. But, you know, I guess you could say a broken clock is right twice a day. You know?
So definitely at the beginning and at the end of the book, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's funny when you mention these gender stereotypes. I had lunch not long ago with a nun who is a nun. She was a doctor. She was a surgeon. And she was a colonel in the United States Army.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, like, what, did you just not want to be an astronaut too? Or like in your free time? Like, but I mean, she just bursts asunder these gender stereotypes of that womanhood means being put into this box, as opposed to the Catholic understanding of it was yet you bring to bear upon the world this gift of your feminine genius that permeates all aspects of civilization and culture. But, when people think that gender is just, about being put in a box, you hear that phrase. Well, gender is just a social construct. How would you respond to that? If you're some university student sitting in a gender studies classroom, the professor just proposed gender is nothing but a social construct, what would be your response to that?
This was my favorite question. I have to say, can I just say that? This is my favorite question because I hadn't received it before and it made me think. I think the response, like the best response I can give in this moment, at least, is gender is a social collaboration.
Okay.
So we'll do a tad bit of theology and then we'll just do like some normal common sense talk. So the tad bit of theology, right? So often we talk about being created male and female in the image and likeness of God. And it's helpful to know that the fathers of the church distinguish between image and likeness, right? For them, the image is a gift that's given. And the likeness is something we grow in through grace and our cooperation with God, right? And we can kind of say maybe the relationship between sex and gender is the same way. I am female. That's a gift given to me by God. But the way I'm going to live out my femininity, right, my gender, the lived expression of that sex, that's going to have a lot to do with the way I cooperate with God, the particular call that he's given to me in life, the relationships that I have where I learn from other women, I learn from other men, I learn from my parents, I learn from my children, right? And all of that will in some way impact the choices I make in terms of the way my gender is expressed, right? So there's certainly a social reality of gender that often is trying to push us to conform. But I think specifically when we're intentional about it, what we realize is you cannot be asocial, right? Even Judith Butler, who's considered the mother of gender studies, would say that. You can't be asocial. You can't pretend as if you don't come from a society, you can't come from a culture. But what you can do is have an intentional response to the stereotypes or to the ideas of gender in your society. And the way you respond can transform them. And here, just a brief personal example. So I'm married to a Frenchman. I have that pleasure and that honor. He reminds me often that it's a privilege. And my husband likes to cook, right? Yeah. So I'm allowed to be in the kitchen once a month when he happens not to be here. So it's always a surprise. And he'll try and be like, I could come home early. I'm like, no, I'm capable. Like I cooked before we got married, So, and one day he said to me, he said, Frenchmen don't cook, but I do. And I thought, wow, he thought about it. Like, this is the way that men are perceived in my culture. Every time I go, not every time, often when I go to my mother-in-law's house, Jennifer, have you started cooking yet? When are you going to? And I'm like, I'm not going to take that pleasure away from my husband. He's intentionally thought about the fact that this is not what men do in my culture. It's not perceived as being masculine, but I love it. And this is what I do. And my husband, you met him briefly before, a very masculine man. Like, he loves sports. He's the mayor of our town. He's an engineer. And what this does too is it forms our sons, right? It forms the way that they understand masculinity and the way they live it out because they want to cook because daddy cooks. And so even in that small way, by pushing back against a culture that might be like, that's not quite masculine, right? And by doing it proudly, he's teaching other men to also to collaborate socially in transforming the meaning of masculinity.
Yeah. So in other words, our identity as male and female isn't so much something culturally imposed upon us, but rather a rock-solid foundation given to us by God upon which we can stand and flourish in a billion different directions.
Exactly.
As opposed to the opposite idea that culture says men are this, fit in that box. And, I think it's understandable anybody would just want to throw that whole notion away after all the centuries of abuse. But what, in your travels around the world, what have you seen about just the variety of ways in which gender is expressed and why that could be misunderstood into thinking that there's this spectrum of gender identities versus a healthy way to understand that all these things that these cultures can teach us about gender expression through a Catholic lens. Does that make sense?
No, certainly. I think one of the things, and I will say this is a difference. I'll begin with the difference, and you'll have to give me like a fashion moment to begin with the difference. So one of the first differences I noticed was the way women dress, right? There's each culture that I was in has like a traditional feminine dress, a traditional way that women dress, and that they're very proud of, right? So I began with the Native Americans. There's certainly great pride in their traditions and the way that women present themselves. It's important to note, right? We did a brief tour of feminism. Feminism was not the same in all cultures. It is true. Women, Native American women, before there was this imposition of Anglo-Saxon law, had a lot more rights and a lot more possibilities to avoid abuse than Anglo-Saxon women did. I went to Mexico. We don't have to say anything more. Everybody knows how beautiful Latino women are. India, everyone was wearing a sari. I bought myself an anarkali, which is an amazingly beautiful dress. Y'all can Google that. Yeah. There's actually feminist meaning to it. There was a woman who was in a relationship with the heir to the throne, which was illicit on both parts, but she was the only one who was punished for it. She was condemned to death. She died. And her name was Anarkali. And in her honor, other women, you can't protest verbally, they began to wear a dress similar to her. So I bought one of those while I was in India. Vietnam, I cannot pronounce the name of the traditional dress. But everywhere I went, there was different ways that women dressed. And yet there was great pride in that. Right? Like, this is the way that we dress as women. This is the way that we express our femininity. So there was certainly a difference. But I have to say, one of the things that impressed me was how much similarity I found throughout the world. And I did about 14 cultures altogether, right? After Asia, I went to Africa, Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya, Israel, and then a little bit of Europe, France, Italy, Poland. And what I saw was basically two things, right? A way of imaging that tends to be male and female, as well as difficulties that exist amongst all cultures where men and women are concerned. And I would say this way of imaging God that I saw in men was certainly this desire to provide, right? And I don't think any of us will be surprised that this has been taken up a lot when we talk about like Catholic masculinism. There's this desire constantly to provide. And you can think about it even in Genesis 2, right? The first man meets the first woman. What does he do? He gives her the only gift he has, the gift of himself, by giving her a name, right? He provides something for her. He's the namer. This is what he has to give, right? And so I thought it was very interesting that there was certainly physical provision. A lot of times I went to different cultures where I was met by priests who made sure that I had everything that was necessary. They would even try and see if there were feminine things that I wanted, like, do you want to look at dresses? What are things that women do when they're in these cultures? So there's certainly a kind of physical providing in terms of all of those, but there's also very much an intellectual provision. I would say there was joy in the sharing of what they knew, as well as, and this impressed me very much in the Native Americans, this idea of men spiritually providing, right? So in one of our interviews, he spoke about how he would watch his grandfather go out every morning to greet the morning sun, and he would stand there and he'd be praying in his native tongue in Cheyenne, and he would ask his father, like, what is grandfather saying? And he's saying he's praying for the world. And he's praying for peace, and he's praying that there won't be another war. And when his son went off to war, he cut pieces of flesh out of his arm, right, as a sacrifice to spiritually provide and hope for peace, and that his son would come back safe from the war, which he did, right? So even this kind of spiritual provision on the part of men. Whereas women, and I think this might be slightly more surprising, what I really saw in women was this imaging of God as Savior. Even if you think, we'll go Genesis 2, right? Adam, this first man, is all by himself. And St. John Paul says this deep sleep that he falls, he's named the animals. There's no one like him. What's he going to do? He falls into this deep sleep. And he says it's kind of a return to almost like death, a return to non-consciousness, a time of before creation. Professor Livio Molina, formerly of the John Paul II Institute in Rome, he said, he's basically bored to death, right? Like, because if he's called to image God, there has to be someone who can receive his gift of self, his gift of, and there's no one to do it, right? So who comes in his time of trouble, right? It's woman who comes, who makes that deliberate choice to receive his gift. And even that phrase, Ezer Kenegdo, which we see helper, helpmate, helpmeet, partner, however it's translated in the Bible that you use, is only ever afterwards used in the Old Testament to refer to God, who comes in times of trouble to save his people. And this is something that I constantly encountered in the women. There was, I think, a very Anglo-Saxon term would be like activism, but I could say perhaps more in Catholic terms, that they had this sense of vocation or this sense of mission, that there were things that need to be changed in their society, and this is what they were going to do. In India, for example, I encountered the woman who created a group called Vimochina in the 70s, when they found that women who were not bringing enough dowry into their families were often being set on fire by their husbands, right? And so they created this group to end these practices, what are often called dowry deaths, and actually to make dowries illegal in India, so that they could avoid these cultural pressures on the part of both men and women to do away with your spouse, to commit suicide because you have shamed your husband and not bringing enough in, or even, and I'll make another reference here to the Native Americans again. You can tell I was extremely impressed. I went to a conference they had against domestic and social violence, and sexual violence. And it was extremely interesting because the focus there was not just on getting women out of violent situations. You have to know that a majority of, and when I say majority, I'm going to say about between 70 and 85% of Native American women have been abused, usually by a non-Native, right? The rates of disappeared women and disappeared young girls is just incredible. But their focus of the conference wasn't, okay, we have to get the laws in place. We have to, that was there. It was certainly there. The focus was, how do we save our men, right? When we are being abused by Native American men, how do we help them get out of the cycles of violence that are often there, the cycles of alcohol abuse, the cycles of drug abuse? How do we recuperate them and help them to come out of the dark place that they are, so we can recreate our culture once again, right? So we can help our society to be healthy. And this was even in women I saw who were film directors, documentary like creators. There was often this idea, this mission, this vocation, there's something wrong, and we need to help save our society. We need to help save men and women. So that was very interesting to see men, this constant sense of provision, not just in a physical way, because I think we kind of tend to reduce it to that, like, he brings home a paycheck, he's a good man. It's a good beginning. I'm very happy my husband brings home a paycheck. But like, there's so much more to that. And also in this terms of like the way that women come into society, and when seeing injustices, don't seek to eliminate the persons who create them, but seek to help in their salvation. So that was beautiful.
Wow. I think we could have used some of those Native Americans on the committee who formed the Me Too movement, because that response to sexual abuse just came and went. It was just like, send them to jail, hashtag Twitter, this, that. There was no like, okay, this authentic compassion for the brokenness of the men who are doing this, not in the sense of relieving them from the responsibility of needing to go to prison and getting reformed, but like, you really want to solve this issue. It's more than just imprisonment. It's like, healing these cultural ideas of what it means to be a man, and all these broken notions. And so it's beautiful. It's interesting when you talk about the women as an idea of savior, you can see how that flow really well out of the feminine genius because of her capacity for empathy, to realize a problem, to intuit a difficulty that needs to be resolved, and then to bring herself, to take care of that. I saw just last week, I was speaking at the Focus conference, Seek. It's a big national Catholic college thing. And I'm getting ready to do this keynote, and it was going to be piped. There's like 700 college students there, but then they're going to pipe it out to about 40 to 50,000 people live stream. And so I'm backstage in the green room, and there's different men and women back there. And I just started having this like cough attack back there. And I'm just like, just coughing up a lung, and I'm trying to drink water and like nothing's doing. And there's probably like 2 or 3 guys back there and 2 or 3 girls. And, the guys aren't doing anything. I mean, they're just watching me just like, have a hairball. And, but then sure enough, one of the Sisters of Life was back there. And then she's like, can I give you a cough drop? Oh, thank you, sister. And, I'm still coughing. Then another girl's there like, we have hot tea. Can I make you a hot tea with some honey? That would really help. Thank you. And so She pours me this hot tea with honey, like literally 45 seconds before I go on stage. And I downed that whole thing, took care of the whole issue. I was able to deliver the presentation. And then I went backstage afterward, just say, thank you. Like, you recognized the issue, you saved the day. It reminded me of a awesome study I saw where they took these boys and girls and they put them in a room adjacent to another room that had a crying baby in that room. And there's an intercom between the two rooms. So you could hear the baby crying, and you had an intercom that you could speak into that room to soothe the baby if you wanted to, or you can just turn off the speaker so you don't hear the baby anymore. So what happened is the girls invariably went over to the intercom, turned it on, and started talking to the baby of just like, hey, are you okay in there? Singing him songs or whatever. Whereas the boys were far more likely to walk over to the switch, click off. Look, the baby's not crying anymore. So they recognized the problem, but the problem is that they had to listen to some crying kid. And so their solution is just flip the switch, the baby's quiet, out of sight, out of mind. Whereas the woman recognized the issue and entered into, in a sense, the savior of the baby, and the real issue is going on. But it all just flows out of who God created us to be as male and female, not so much society's expectations of what's imposed upon us, but that the feminine genius of what he's created a woman for, can permeate every aspect of human life. Now, if people want to learn more about what you're doing, the website, the courses, please share with our listeners how they can connect with you, the website, the courses, all the stuff that you're doing, and then the new book I understand that you're just coming out with now.
Exactly. So you can go to our website is cultureandgender.com, the International Institute of Culture and Gender Studies. And you'll see there we have some blog pieces that we've been working on, but specifically we're in the midst of, we've begun with international online courses. And we're really proud of these because we're not only tackling subjects such as gender in the Catholic tradition, right? We kind of want to look especially at the tradition in the long perspective. Who are the men and women in our faith, in history, who very much committed to expanding the way we can live out our masculinity and femininity. But we also have a course there on masculinity, right? I think which is one of the topics that needs to be addressed now, right? We've done a lot of work on femininity, feminism, and we need to continue that. But especially in my travels, this is what I saw. Men are beginning to feel lost. They're not sure how to recuperate that. Male friendships are breaking down. This was another almost common theme that I saw across the world. And so we have a course on masculinity being run by an amazing Mexican professor, Maria Guadalupe Rodriguez Garcia. And we're also doing presentations specifically for parishes and Catholic schools to help parents understand what gender is, right? So a lot of times parents don't even know how to have, we flip out when we have to have the talk with children, much less talks on pornography. Like, how do you talk to a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, 7-year-old on pornography? Now, how do you have questions with it, conversations with them on gender? So these things are available on our website. And in the next month, my first book will be out, right? So usually as an academic, which is my training, you're supposed to do the big academic tome, right? That's like this big. And then you do kind of like the popular book. But there was just such a need that I was like, forget it. We'll do the popular book later and the academics can attack me afterwards. So the book, Woman and Man, He Resurrected Them to kind of complement the man and woman He created them of John Paul II. This will be coming out next in February. Currently, it will be available on ATC Publications. And we're working, this is in India. We wanted to make sure that it's also available in developing countries who are dealing with a lot of gender ideology through international development and international aid. And then we're working right now with American publishers to make sure that will also be possible to get in the US. So if you go to ATC Publishers, I suggest the ebook so you don't have to wait 20 days for it to come in. But hopefully in a month or two, we'll also have it available much more quickly in the US.
And will there be a link to get the book on your website, the Culture and Gender site? If someone wants to go there, they'll be able to get it too?
Certainly. We won't make you have to search too hard or too far through Google to find it. We'll try and make it easier for everyone.
Okay, and we'll put a link in the show notes on YouTube and on Spotify and iTunes, so those of you who are watching or listening can just click there, go over and get the book. Because, I mean, catechists, CCD directors, teachers, principals, I mean, we need an answer to this stuff. We need to form policies for the schools of, what do we believe? Because the beauty of all of this conflict is, like you said, it's going to give birth to something of a new clarification, a deeper understanding of answers to questions that we weren't asking 50 years ago, that maybe the feminists were asking, and they're developing this robust gender theory, and now we're having this reaction to it. And thanks be to God, God's already given us the gift of the theology of the body as this kind of theological time bomb, but like you said, John Paul kind of dropped the mic of just like, okay, here's the baton, go get them, guys. And so, I want to thank you for your part, in taking this to the next level. And thank you for taking the time to be on with us today. And I also want to just thank our sponsor, Hallow, Catholic prayer app. They've got a great thing coming up right now called the Pray. It's like a hashtag Pray 40 challenge. 34,000 people as of today have already signed up for this thing in preparation for Lent. And so it's going to be every single day. Just got to click a button on the app. Okay, hey, here's the prayer we're going to do today. Here's the meditation. Here's a scriptural reading. Here's a song. Get a game plan going into Lent instead of getting to like Holy Week and be like, I probably should have thought this through a little bit better. They've got it all thought through for you, okay? And so, again, check out, it's just hashtag Pray40 Challenge, or you can just go to hallow.com/lustisboring and check that out. So you're going to want to check out Hallow, Exodus 90. Both of them have awesome Lent programs. Taking advantage of it. So, Doctor, again, thank you for coming on. I look forward to reading the book. I asked you to email it to me, so frankly, I can't wait to read this thing. And just thank you for the gift that you are and of the church in the midst of this cultural battle.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, Jason, and also so many other people who I know are listening and who are watching who have these questions, right? Who want to be able to better understand their faith and who want to be able to better proclaim the good news that we will be resurrected as women and as men.
And that's the key. This is good news. Sometimes on these hot polemical topics, it gets, the church is transphobic, hate-monging. Like, ultimately, what we have to give is part of the gospel, which is all good news. That it's good news that your body is meaningful, not meaningless.
Amen.
The good news is that your gender is a gift given to you by a loving Father who has a plan for your life. And although we might feel this disintegration, this tension, this disharmony and discord, it exists in all of us in one way or another. But the good news is that redemption is real, resurrection is real. We just have to trust the Father. So, well, God bless you. And again, thank you for coming on.
Thank you. God bless.